For those that don't know, what is your PhD in and how did you get to where you are today?
Gosh, my PhD is in ecology, more specifically marine ecology. And I kind of ended up where I am almost a little bit by accident, sort of, but not really. I always knew I wanted to work with animals and more specifically wildlife. But I actually grew up in the prairie provinces of Canada. So the nearest bit of ocean was about a 20-hour drive from where I grew up. So the ocean was this like big, foreign, vast thing that I had never seen and really didn't know a whole lot about. In my bachelor's degree, we weren't really taught about the ocean.
Yeah.
And then almost by accident, I accepted a PhD project working in the Canadian subarctic on a remote set of islands with this thing called a seabird, which again, I hadn't seen a whole lot of. And the islands and the birds were so spectacular that it just completely won me over. And I decided that that was where my heart was. And
Yeah.
here we are 20 years later, still doing the exact same thing.
That's really cool. That's awesome. So the Eco Team has come to know you through the YouTube clip Plastic Ocean. We often use the section of the video where you are dissecting the bird to help people understand how bad plastic contamination of the oceans has become. Do you ever become desensitized by seeing the plastic infiltration of birds so regularly?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So yes, and it's both a good thing and a bad thing. So I think personally, it's my brain kind of going into like self-protection or self-preservation mode.
Yeah.
The things that I'm seeing are very hard to deal with. And so my brain kind of wants to separate my head from my heart. And so I tell my PhD students and my master's students that I've become almost like I go into zombie mode.
Yeah.
So I go in and I do my job because it's important and somebody has to be the one who does it. But the emotion of it, the impact of it, I often don't feel that until many weeks or sometimes months later when I reflect back on, how much things have changed over the last 5 or 10 years,
Yeah.
exactly what I've been witnessing. And I think the thing I struggle with the most, if I'm being honest, is maybe not what I'm witnessing, but each year I bring the next generation of young scientists to islands with me to work with the birds to see the plastic. And they're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. They're young, passionate, enthusiastic, probably just like you and all of your peers. But for them, it's very, very new and very confronting, and their head and their heart isn't able to do what mine does yet because I've got 10 or 20 years of training.
Yeah.
And so they feel it very, very deeply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see why in your profession it is important to not feel it so deeply so that you can go through those discoveries.
So
Do
you
you?
can keep going.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think that people, generally speaking, understand the enormity of plastic pollution, or do you think that they don't understand the enormity?
Oh gosh, you're asking me questions that nobody ever asked me. Another really great question. Um, Again, another yes and no question. So I think yes, you're probably going to get a visit from my dogs in a second. I can hear them running in the background. Apologies for any noise in the interview.
That's okay.
So I think, plastics is everywhere now. It's in documentaries, it's on the news, it's in our newspaper. So I think people understand that it is a critical issue, that it's probably rapidly getting worse and that we all need to do something about it.
Yeah.
But I think what's not known by most people is kind of the intricacies of just how it impacts our marine ecosystems and our marine species.
Yeah.
So a really good analogy I like to give is think about anyone you know, friends, family, and probably someone who has what we call like a chronic condition.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe diabetes or like a heart condition or something like that. On the outside of that person, they're living, breathing, talking, going to the grocery store, buying a new car, They're still alive and they're functioning in society, but they're suffering, right? They have pain, they might have a shorter lifespan, those kinds of things. That happens to wildlife too.
Yeah.
But the difference is that for birds, whales, tuna, dolphin, turtles, they can't obviously communicate that to us. They don't speak English. They can't point to their wing and say, my wing hurts here. So my job and your job is to figure out how they hurt and where they hurt when we aren't speaking the same language. And so what scientists are finding is that a lot of the impact of plastic, and this is the bit I think most people don't yet know about, but I wish they did, a lot of the impact of plastic is the stuff we can't see.
Yeah.
So while the images of albatross with plastic in their stomach and whales entangled in nets is incredibly traumatic and tragic, that is probably just the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think people often will capture that image of a turtle in suffocating with plastic bag, and we see that, and I think that's important to raise awareness. But I think you're correct. I think a lot of people don't see the enormity, and that the fact that every single piece of plastic that has ever been created is still in existence to today. And I think that this out of sight, out of mind mentality seems to be a big part of the human psyche. So how do you think we combat that attitude?
Yeah, I really bumped into that problem head first when I published a paper a couple of years ago, and it went all around the globe. It was, really big in the media, and it was about plastic on one of the most remote islands in the world called Henderson Island in the South Pacific. And that's really fun for people to look up on Google Maps, because you basically have to zoom out and then zoom out and then zoom out. And only when you're way up here can you see that Henderson is like this little dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that's where I lived, with no power, no running water, and virtually no outside communication for 4.5 months.
Wow, that's a long time.
But, the paper went boom. People were really excited or terrified to know that one of the most remote and heavily protected islands in the world, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, had somewhere in the range of 38 million pieces of plastic on just one beach. But what ended up happening in the aftermath of that was that people started coming to me and saying, but I'll never go to Henderson, and I'll probably never even go to that part of the Pacific. And surely that plastic comes from China, or it's so far away from my day-to-day life that it's, as you say, out of sight, out of mind. And so they were amazed, but they didn't feel that sense of connection or responsibility for the problem. They didn't want to change what they were doing or anything like that. And so how I dealt with it was to go, okay, as a scientist, I haven't quite done my job right. I haven't communicated the scope, the severity of the problem. And so I looked for islands closer to home here in Australia that have the same level of problem. The beaches look the same, completely covered in plastic. And my hope was not to embarrass those islands, but to show Australians that the problem is here. It's on our doorstep, and it's affecting all of us wherever you are in the world. And so there's this sense of urgency to think about when and where we use plastic, and more importantly, to lobby our politicians to do something about it.
Yeah, definitely. Would you say this is why you've chosen Lord Howe Island to do a lot of your research?
Yeah, so I kind of have two main islands that answer the same question, but using two different things. So Lord Howe Island is very much focused on the birds and the birds eating plastic, because Lord Howe Island just happens to be really lucky in that the beaches don't actually accumulate hardly any plastic. So you go to Lord Howe Island and the beaches are pristine. It's so, so beautiful. But there's another island on our west coast in Western Australia called the Cocos Keeling Islands and the Christmas Islands. So they're a group. And those islands are really fortunate in that their birds don't ingest any plastic,
Yeah.
but the beaches there are covered.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really those two sets of islands, one on the east coast, Lord Howe Island, and one on the west coast, Cocos and Christmas, really help tell two different stories. One is about wildlife being impacted, and one is about beaches being impacted, and kind of the diversity of issues, everything from like social issues like tourism through to biodiversity issues.
Yeah, amazing. So for anyone that doesn't know, you have just returned from Lord Howe Island. Did you find out
Actually,
anything?
2 days ago.
Did you find out anything new?
Yes, this is a brand new project. It's only in its second year, which is quite unusual for me because I have kind of a little bit famous for working with really long-term data sets. So some of the data sets we have are 20 years running, every single year for 20 years.
Yeah.
So to only have a data set of 2 years is a little bit unusual. But this data set is looking at when a bird leaves Lord Howe Island, if it has plastic in its stomach or no plastic, does that influence whether or not it survives and we ever see it again? So does it survive and does it come back to Lord Howe Island the next year and then the next year and the next year? So that's one of the other big challenges or unknowns in the plastics research space is, again, the broader community knows all about, bottle caps and cigarette lighters in albatross stomachs and whales being entangled in nets.
Yeah.
But those mortality events sometimes can be a little bit rare that we actually see them in such a visual way. It's rare that we can photograph them like that. What scientists suspect is that the mortality is probably actually taking place at sea. As you said before, out of sight, out of mind, out there in the big blue ocean, thousands of kilometers from beaches and cities and all those kinds of things. And so this project on Lord Howe Island was about answering that question. If you have plastic or you have no plastic, does that change your odds or your chances of me ever seeing you again? And I can't quite answer that question yet. We're waiting until we have 3 years of data and we only have 2, but maybe we can follow up next year.
That would be amazing. I'd definitely be interested in hearing the results of that study. So my next question for you is, are you seeing evidence that the chemicals contained in plastics are being transferred to the animals that consume them, like the birds or any marine animals?
Yeah, really good question. So yes, and not in a completely predictable way. And I think without going into the complex chemistry, that's basically because currently humans manufacture something in the range of, the number is huge, more than 100,000 synthetic chemicals. And that's a lot. And we scientists, particularly conservation scientists, can't possibly keep up with the rate of manufacture and production. And so we kind of focus on a relatively small subset. And of those, some of them have a really strong relationship with plastic. In other words, those chemicals are innately linked or manufactured inside the plastic, or it attaches onto the surface of the plastic like a magnet or a sponge. And then other chemicals, not so much. They just kind of float around in the ocean or in our atmosphere, and maybe they don't interact quite as often.
Yeah.
And so we have to be quite careful that we pick and focus on the right chemical to ask the right question. But all of that was a long-winded way of saying, yes, we do find that when an animal has more plastic, so the more plastic you have in your stomach, the higher the concentration of certain chemicals that you have in your bloodstream and in your other tissues. And this can be really worrying because, again, that's that invisible effect. You can't see chemicals in the bloodstream, you can't see chemicals in the liver, but they're there. And we know that some of those chemicals are associated with things that can cause mortality in an animal, so like maybe cancer, but also cause things that don't cause mortality or death of an animal, so maybe infertility. So again, this is one of those challenges that scientists and the public have to grapple with is the animal could be alive, living, breathing, walking around, flying and migrating across the world's oceans, doing all the amazing things that they do. And yet because of certain chemicals in their bloodstream, they could be infertile or not breeding or something like that, where they're alive, but they're not actually doing much to contribute to the population. And this is deeply concerning for us.
Yeah, it is very, very concerning. So there are quite a few alternatives that to plastic coming onto the market that don't have these chemicals, that are made from things like potato and cornstarch. Why do you think these types of innovations aren't rolled out quicker?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're exactly as you say, they're innovative, and they're often being produced by our youth as well. They're people who are not working in the plastics manufacturing space, who just decide that they're going to do this as part of a research project or just a passion project, and voila, they turn some waste material into something amazing and inspire us all. But I think the challenge is that plastics, the reason why we make plastics in the way that we do, including adding these chemicals, is that plastics, our expectation or our demand for plastics is that they meet certain expectations. So they need to be lightweight, they need to be long lasting, they need to be flexible or maybe rigid, or we have like these very, very specific expectations. And from an industry perspective, there's often a belief that a lot of these alternative plastics can't yet deliver on those expectations. We kind of have this like status quo where the existing products are still considered far superior. And I think we're on the cusp of some of change in that kind of mental acceptance, but we don't seem to be quite there yet.
Yeah. As you've said previously in this interview, plastic has infiltrated every corner of our planet, which is quite a dire problem. But a lot of people try to place blame or responsibility on people. Whose responsibility do you think is the plastic pollution? Does it rest on individuals, industry, government, or some other organization?
Yeah, I mean, I am reluctant sometimes to put the blame on us as individuals, because you and I would know that even if you're really educated on how harmful plastic is and how much you can do to avoid it in your day-to-day life, and even if you work really hard to avoid it, it's still really hard.
Yeah.
And certain things are so close to being impossible to avoid. I mean, I try really hard in my home, but I definitely still have plastic. I'm not perfect. And so I think that individuals can do better? Yeah, I do think that there is a portion of our society that isn't quite on board yet, or maybe just every now and then we get a little bit lazy and we fall for that word convenience. You know, we're all guilty of it sometimes. So I think we can do better, but I think if we really want large-scale, meaningful change, we need the government to absolutely get on board with this and recognize this environmental crisis for what it is. It's a crisis.
Yeah.
And the government needs to realize that there are a lot of us who would be very, very supportive of some very meaningful, positive policy change.
Yeah. As you said, it can be really hard for individuals to try and make the right choice and avoid plastics, as it obviously is a part of our everyday society. You go to the supermarket, most things are wrapped in plastic. What are real ways people can make a difference, though, for those that are trying to do the right thing? Is it all about thinking about purchase choices and making it known to our politicians that they need to create legislation to reduce plastic use significantly, or do you think it's something else?
I like to kind of run with the assumption that most of us, so a long time ago, I used to say things like, get your bamboo toothbrush and your cotton reusable bag and your keep cup and your mesh produce bags and all those kinds of things. And I have to say that I still think there's not enough of us doing those things. And I do actually think that they matter. So there is wiggle room. There's definitely room for improvement there. And I like for people to set that up as an individual or like a family or maybe a class or business challenge, like set yourself a challenge to get your whole family, your whole class doing bamboo toothbrushes, and then don't stop there, elevate things and always take it to the next level. It just becomes such a habit and ingrained good habit after that. But I think in that is that is telling us a story. That some people are still not fully engaged in this issue. Mm-hmm. And to bring this issue around, to turn this ship around, we can't just have 20% of the people on this planet doing all the hard work or 50%. We really need more, like almost like vaccinations. We need 70 or 80% of us all doing the hard work. And so my most important request, I think, from people lately is to have this important conversation about environmental issues, if it's plastic or it's biodiversity loss or climate change. Have that difficult discussion with those who aren't yet on board. Don't preach to the converted, but challenge yourself to have those tough conversations with someone who maybe doesn't really want to listen, and just slowly have that discussion and maybe see if we can make some positive change, because we need them. We really need their support. We need them on board.
Yeah, definitely. So I've got 2 more questions for you. Do you think there will be more plastic than fish in the sea by 2050? From where I sit, it looks like it's going to be very likely.
I think possibly we are already there. So there's been some really interesting research just in the last couple of years. So in 2014, there was kind of a foundational paper that everyone got really excited about by Marcus Ericsson, 5 gyres. And it basically said that in just the top 10 centimeters of the world's oceans, it was estimated that there was somewhere in the range of 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic. Now, this is such a vast, vast number that, once we start talking in excess of millions, you start talking millions and then billions and then trillions. I had to come up with an analogy in a talk I gave in 2017, because I think these numbers are just so huge that what's a billion? How many millions are in a billion and how many billions are in a trillion? And it becomes so big that we can't really relate to it. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I kind of related it to the number of stars in the Milky Way, because it's something that most of us have at one point in time in our lives gazed upon. Yeah. And the estimate is that at that time, the plastic in the top 10 centimeters of the world's oceans, that 5.25 trillion, was around 50 times more plastic in ocean than there were stars in the Milky Way. And so I hoped that gave people an opportunity to kind of grapple with just what 5 trillion pieces of plastic looks like. It's a lot. But what happened was that study in 2014, without going into technical details, used a very particular mesh size when doing its sampling. And it was what we call a coarse mesh size. So basically it allowed very, very small pieces of plastic to pass through undetected. Yeah. In the last 5, 6, 7 years since that study was published, scientists all around the world have started using much smaller mesh sizes, almost microscopic, so tiny that it's picking up the smallest particles of plastic that so small you can't see them with the naked eye pretty much. Yeah. And what that suggests is that estimate of 5 trillion pieces of plastic is very out of date and likely was what we call conservative. So it was an underestimate, possibly by multiple orders of magnitude, meaning it wasn't 5 trillion. It might have been 50 trillion or 500 trillion. Ultimately, it's hard to know. The way we do science keeps improving, and so those numbers will keep changing. I think what matters is that the numbers are already huge, and every little bit of change that we do and every piece of plastic we pick up on a beach and prevent it from fragmenting into 1,000 or 100,000 pieces, that matters. So let's do that.
Yeah, definitely. So my last question to you is, I've seen reports about humans eating a credit card's worth of plastic each week on average, about plastics not now being dispersed amongst the atmosphere, hence we're breathing them in, and that they are also infiltrating our water supplies. Why do you think more people don't change their behavior after hearing things like this?
It's a conundrum that I don't quite have the answer to. So when I first started working on plastic ingestion in wildlife, we found that some of the articles that we were writing weren't really getting a whole lot of media interest, that the media had kind of just gotten a bit bored with that story. And so also that we found that we weren't quite getting the change in policy and the change in day-to-day consumer behavior that we were after as well. We were really hoping that what people were seeing in seabirds and in turtles and things would really ignite people and give them the momentum to change. And sometimes it happened for a few days or a few weeks, but then it dropped off.
Yeah.
And so scientists kind of thought, well, how do we keep this momentum going? How do we keep the positive messaging going and really give people the initiative to change? And so that discussion soon changed to, we need to link this to human health. We need to show people that it's not just about birds and turtles and whales, because if you're like me and you grew up in the prairie provinces of Canada, or maybe you grew up in Alice Springs or anywhere where you're thousands of kilometers from the ocean, maybe you grew up that this is just kind of an abstract environment where it just doesn't quite connect with you. We need to connect with people. And so, as you say, in the intervening couple of years, there's been all of these studies, plastic in beer of all things. I mean, you think people would care? Salt. There was one last week or the week before, plastic in baby poo. So that was, again, scientists really saying, okay, maybe if you don't care about beer, and everybody uses cooking salt, but maybe you don't care about cooking salt or bottled water, or you will care about your children. And I'm not saying that people don't care about their children. Of course they do. But I was kind of surprised that that story also, it hit the news for maybe a couple of hours one evening, and then the next day we all moved on. And so I don't have an answer to your question, and I don't know what the next step is. What more can scientists do? I think the solution is no longer in scientists' hands. It rests with the rest of us.
Yeah, I agree. So I would just like to say thank you so much for doing this interview with me, Jennifer. You have provided some amazing insight, and I'm sure everyone will take it away. And I'll definitely take you up on that follow-up next year, which will be amazing.
Yeah, let's book that in.
So thank you so much.
Thank you for some of the most creative and thought-provoking questions I think I've ever been asked. So well done.
No problem. Have a lovely day.
Bye.